This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. What do you guys want to talk about?
So, I don't honestly know how long I want to spend talking about this whole investigation fallout. It sucks. It's unfortunate. I think a lot of us already saw the writing on the wall once the rumors started circulating about the negotiations of Tony trying to buy out the remainder of Punk's AEW contract. Whether that was to buy his silence or just try to extricate himself from Punk altogether without twisting the knife any further, we don't really know. I do know that this entire investigation has been completely one-sided, especially from the people reporting on it. Our so-called journalist experts that only report news call it right down the middle. Right, just like every mainstream news outlet calls everything right down the middle with no bias. I mean, why do you think cable news networks' ratings are in the shithole? But it would appear that for where we are now, everything that has come out of this third-party investigation of the all-out post-media scrum fight, it appears that CM Punk is now officially gone and will not be back in AEW. At least for the foreseeable future. It's possible things could change, but as of right now, he's pretty much gone. And the Elite have already started airing vignettes of their return to television, indicating that they'll be back to play wrestle on TV before we know it. Obviously, if you're somebody that sides with the Elite in all this, you're probably content on the decision. I, for one, still have a lot of unanswered questions with this whole investigation that I would like legitimate answers to. Answers that we'll probably never get, since the entire reporting on this story has been completely one-sided, benefiting the Elite. We've not heard one single take from anybody on Punk's side of the aisle, up to and including Punk himself, who has been totally silent about it. Whether or not that is for legal reasons, we still don't really know. Again, maybe it ties in with Tony trying to buy out Punk's contract. Translation, buying his silence more than anything. And I guess I'll start with this, since it relates to the Tony Khan CM Punk relationship. It's no secret at this point that Tony has been very vocal about wanting CM Punk in AEW since the very beginning. We know Tony was a CM Punk guy, and from the Elite's point of view, they probably saw that as a conflict of interest, seeing as how they were the ones that really kickstarted the whole project, and Tony hopped on board to fund it and give them that platform to broadcast it to a nationwide audience. Whatever wet dream fantasy Kenny Omega and the Beta Bucks had, whatever their indie vision was for AEW from the jump, we sort of got a taste of that when the initial All In show back from 2018 came up, before they even got the name All Elite Wrestling. It was exactly what any logical, rational-minded wrestling fan would have pictured a wrestling company being operated by three goofballs that had no mind for the business and no experience running a serious wrestling promotion. A bunch of untrained outlaw asshats that couldn't draw money in a million years. The Joey Janela's, the Jimmy Havoc's, the Michael Nakazawa's, the goddamn Marco Stunts of the world. All those clowns were the initial part of the guys that Omega and the Bucks wanted as part of that initial roster assembly. And when Tony Khan quickly caught on to the fact that a lot of those guys were never going to draw and evidently run off viewers in the end, especially when AEW got their television deal with TNT and TBS, that's when he realized that he needed some actual name power. They had Chris Jericho and Jon Moxley to a lesser degree, but those guys were only going to be able to man the fort for so long before people got bored of them too. He needed his main attraction. The one guy that Tony knew the fans would give a warm, welcoming reception to after all those years away from the business. And he was right. Because when CM Punk returned to Chicago in the late summer of last year, it was one of the most memorable returns and probably the most memorable moment in AEW's entire existence. Even the Bryan Danielsons and the Adam Coles of the world didn't get the response that CM Punk got when he showed up. It was a genuine reaction, the likes of which people probably thought they would never see again. CM Punk, for all of his flaws and drawbacks, you knew that he was actually genuinely excited to be there. He was happy to be back. He was happy to get the opportunity to wrestle in front of fans again. And unlike his run in WWE, where he felt he was constantly being held back from reaching his fullest potential, now he was actually given the chance to reconcile a lot of that. He was given the platform to actually carry the company. And it was his turn to give back to the fans and work with the guys that he wanted to work with, to elevate the guys that actually had potential. The FTRs, the MJFs, the Wardlows, the Darby Allins, the Miros, the Eddie Kingstons, the Acclaims, the Ricky Starks, the Powerhouse Hobbs of the world. I could go on and on. Punk wanted to exclusively work with those guys. Because while the Elite were trying to ram a bunch of untrained green indie guys down our throats for the better part of 2 years that had zero potential and were only there because they were friends with Omega and the Bucks, Punk actually had an eye for real talent that everybody else saw. The real wrestling fans, at least. Not the subset of AEW marks that cheered all the original garbage they were being spoon-fed from the beginning. So, of course, Punk arrives on the scene, and what happens for the next 12 months? He starts becoming the number one draw each week on television. He starts elevating guys and working with real talent that had star qualities. He generates buzz and attention, the likes of which AEW had never reached at any other point. He was responsible for doing that business with MJF in the spring of this year, helping to facilitate AEW's first $1 million gate. Again, despite what people try to tell you otherwise. And unfortunately, by the time you get to the point where they start plugging him in the program with Adam Page for the world title, that's when things pretty much start to go south. And you'll recall, go back and listen to my reviews of those Adam Page CM Punk segments during my AEW reports. I was not a fan of that program from the onset, and a lot of that had to specifically do with the promo exchanges between Punk and Page, where it just felt way too insider. Now come to find out, those promos were not entirely supposed to be part of the original planning, hence why everyone had a lot of questions concerning what the hell was really going on with the whole Punk-Page drama. Why was Adam Page seemingly pissed at Punk for no reason? Why was he acting like a childish dick to him every week despite him being a babyface at the time? Why was Punk playing it off like he was confused too? Well, turns out Punk had no idea why Page was so mad at him. Took a couple of months during the whole All Out investigation to finally realize that Adam Page was going into business for himself, being an unprofessional douchebag and trying to air dirty laundry in public to get under Punk's skin. All because the Bucks and Omega didn't like Punk and were doing everything to drive a wedge between him and the rest of the locker room. And, that quickly became the story of everyone sort of being divided amongst two parties at that point. Seemingly, that's also around the same time when other backstage issues were starting to circulate between the boys. And the girls, I guess. Everyone getting into fights, social media engagements. Everybody seemed to be at each other's throats every week. It's amazing how all that seemed to fester pretty much around the same time frame. And again, I'm not trying to detract from the investigation because that's kind of the main talking point with all this, but going back to it, the questions I have, now knowing that everything's been concluded, air quotes around that for whatever that means, why are we still only hearing one side of the argument? Why is it that all of this fallout seems to only be benefiting the Bucks and Kenny Omega? Even if you think Punk was in the wrong based on everything that he said and did in that press scrum, okay, fine. We can have that conversation. I probably would have handled that situation differently, but that's understandable. But what about the people that actually witnessed what went down in that locker room? Are we supposed to completely ignore Ace Steel's side of the story? Or his wife's side of the story, since she was also apparently in the room when that all happened? Or what about Punk himself? Again, unless there are legal circumstances where he's prevented from talking about anything, who's buying his silence in all this? Is it Tony Khan? Because Tony's sure keeping everything under wraps. God, that Ariel Helwani interview told you everything you need to know about how close-minded Tony is when it comes to a lot of the operational procedures about AEW. That guy will not spill the beans about anything. And from their point of view, it is incredibly frustrating. You know, for a company that always likes to dish out their insider terms and try to appeal to the hardcore marks, well, Tony's sure keeping his mouth shut with a lot of things that the hardcore marks would like to know about. I don't know. I have no idea what to make of all this, even now knowing what we do about the entire situation. Again, from one point of view, will we ever find a neutral position about anything that actually went down during that fight? Probably not. I think the Elite camp got what they wanted from the day Punk first showed up in AEW. They were threatened by him being there because they knew Punk was going to outdraw and outperform them on every level. So out of spite and jealousy, they were going to ensure that they did everything to convince Tony to rid Punk from the company altogether. And from Punk's standpoint, maybe he was all right with that. Knowing that he was always in an uphill battle against the Elite, knowing that he was never going to see eye to eye on the way AEW should be operated versus the Elite's vision, maybe Punk just threw up his hands and said, fuck it. Let's just end this relationship now while I still may be in Tony's good graces. Tony, we can negotiate a contract buyout. I'll stay quiet because I know what actually happened in that locker room. Obviously, none of the media sources actually want to get a fair, objective view of what went down. All the crap I've had to deal with working with these assholes since I showed up. I try to keep my distance, but now that we've opened up this can of worms, the best thing for all parties is for me to go, give me my final payout, and I'll walk away with my chunk of change. The Elite can be content with their little win, and if our paths cross again in the future, maybe we talk about doing business. When those egotistical maniacs are out of the equation and we can actually talk about running a serious wrestling promotion. But until then, I'm hurt. I can't wrestle because I have my torn tricep I'm dealing with. I'm going to be out with surgery, pretty much gone through the rest of the year. Rather than me sitting on the shelf and having to listen to these jagoffs complain about me not being cooperative with their way of conducting business, I'll give them what they want. But in the meantime, you give me what I want so we can depart on good terms. Whatever's left of it. And now we're going to see how things reflect on the show with Punk basically being blacklisted from the company. How are the ratings going to do? How's the booking going to be? Who's going to be spotlighted versus the guys who are going to be pushed to the back burner? I mean, I can already tell you we're seeing signs of that just based on the last 2 weeks alone. Colt Cabana showing up on Dynamite this week, right after the conclusion of the investigation and Punk being gone from the company. It's not a coincidence. You know, meanwhile, the guys that Punk did do business with and actually tried to elevate by working programs with them, you know, we're seeing how a lot of those guys are being treated now. Do I think they're going to take a hit in the ratings over it? Possibly. I think AEW's dedicated audience is going to watch no matter what. I mean, most of the AEW loyalists were never Team Punk to begin with, so I don't think they're going to lose sleep over it. For some of the casuals or leftover fans that wanted to give AEW a chance to play it straight and being a real wrestling product for a change instead of the Elite's version of what they think wrestling is supposed to be, I imagine those people will tune out. It'll probably be a handful of people they lose out of all this, but enough to really affect the company gravely? No, I don't think so. Not enough for them to lose so many viewers that the network starts questioning things. Again, you have to remember, AEW is already as niche products can get. The people watching the product now, they're going to watch no matter what. Whether or not Punk is there, it doesn't matter. The overall presentation of the show, that's a different topic entirely. From what I've seen based on everything in the last few months, I'm not all that optimistic about the way the company's headed into 2023. Even the MJF booking, I'm starting to question a little bit at this point. And he wasn't even on the show this week. I've said for the longest time that when it came to AEW's television show, I was primarily watching for two things. Three when Bryan Danielson was actually somebody worth paying attention to. Those two guys were CM Punk and MJF. Anything else that happened on that show, I usually took with a grain of salt because I expected it to be no good. You eliminate Punk from the discussion, that pretty much leaves MJF as the only thing worth devoting my attention to on this program week to week. It sucks we're at this point now, but Tony Khan did it to himself. Whatever comes out of Punk being gone from AEW, it's all on Tony. I don't care what influence Omega or the Bucks had in impacting his decision. Tony's the man, he's the boss, he's the guy in charge. Allegedly. Whenever people aren't holding him by his nutsack. But every decision he makes for this company always falls back on him in the end. And if he decided that the best thing for business was to let Punk go, okay, fine. But he also has to accept the consequences of what comes out of that. I personally think it's a bad move, but we'll see if I'm proven wrong in the end. I've been proven wrong before, but I've also been on record saying that Punk and MJF have been really the only two consistently good things about AEW in the last year plus. And I think the ratings and overall viewership have been a good reflection of that. From a comparative standpoint, this is equivalent to a WWE letting John Cena or a Roman Reigns go. CM Punk is AEW's John Cena. CM Punk is AEW's Roman Reigns. Whether or not people want to accept that reality, Punk was their main draw. He was their top guy. He moved the needle for that company in more ways than you can imagine. And now that he's gone, they've got to find someone to replace Punk in that top babyface role. And I personally don't think they'll ever find that guy again. MJF is their default top guy now, but he's the last guy they need to be positioning as the top babyface. I mean, if they're looking to kill his career, they can turn him babyface. But I just don't see how you can replace Punk as the main attraction. Nobody in that company is or was at that level. Nobody has that star quality. It's been a rough road for AEW for pretty much the entire year. The injuries, the constant shifting of original plans for top guys, the booking catastrophes, inconsistencies up and down the card. Now they pretty much let their top guy walk out the door, probably with one of the biggest payouts he's ever received doing business for them. All because three egocentric assholes couldn't accept that they were not the main dudes. It's really what this all boils down to. And you see what happens when you listen to the wrong people. So with that all said, I guess the Punk discussion was a good lead into how I felt about this episode of Dynamite. And again, I'm going to go back to what I talked about during the whole investigation fallout, specifically on the subject of who's influencing Tony's decision-making at this point. Because if you're looking for a textbook model of figuring out which AEW roster talents were Punk guys versus talents that are more in the Jericho elite camp, I honestly don't know if you could find a better episode. If Tony's goal was to weed out all the Punk guys and try to disassociate any party that was on Team Punk within the last year, job well done. That is the best booking job Tony's done since AEW's inception 3 years ago. Pretty much anybody on this week's show, or even last week's show for that matter, that have outright defended or embraced working with CM Punk in any way, shape, or form, those guys have either been left off the show entirely, or in the case of the opener here, jobbed out and made to look like complete fucking schlubs. Right out of the gate, we get this Jay Lethal Darby Allin match, which was a rematch from a TV match that literally happened like 2 weeks ago. And last time we saw Lethal and Darby on this show, I'm pretty sure Darby was being crushed by a giant steel garage door. Seemingly after a couple weeks, tape those ribs up. Good to go. And if you're Darby Cena, you can magically spring back into action and do all your usual shit you normally do in a match. So after 3 years, no one's smarting him up yet, apparently. But if we looked past that obvious booking flaw, it was your standard AEW TV match where they immediately go out to the floor and start doing 100 different things. One of those spots including a deal where Lethal went to try and hook Darby in a figure four underneath the ring barricade. And not only did the figure four lead to virtually nothing, and Darby was right back on his feet seconds later, they actually set this up with Darby voluntarily crawling underneath the barricade in order to put himself in position for Lethal to hook his legs. And if you think I'm ribbing, go back and watch the fucking tape. Dead serious. Somewhere in here, Sanjay Dutt and Satnam Singh came down to ringside, just nonchalantly walking out from the back during the match while Bryce Remsburg stands there playing with his dick, doesn't bother to immediately go out and give him the boot. He just watches him meander down to the ring, expecting them to apparently just stand there at ringside and play by the rules, because all AEW officials are fucking retards in kayfabe. So they come back from break, where Darby's trying to milk a comeback on Lethal. Finally, they do a spot where Darby tries to hit Satnam Singh with a suicide dive out to the floor. And, of course, Darby's a $150 soaking wet. So he just comically bounces off of Singh's body like he just went sailing into one of those blow-up playhouses for kids. And it is at that point, of all times for the referees to eject somebody from ringside, even though the heels were literally standing there doing jack shit before Darby decided he was going to go airborne and try to take out the heels on the floor, now Remsburg sends the heels to the back. And even Taz was calling BS on it, pointing out the obvious that Sanjay and Satnam were literally standing there minding their own business before Darby decided to be a suicide bomber for no apparent reason. And of course, Darby was the one that looked like an idiot because Satnam just watched Darby bounce off of him like he was nothing. And then came the finish, which again, I will reiterate. If you are looking to lay out a chart of anybody on this roster who is a CM Punk guy versus anybody on the roster who are elite Jericho guys, which camp do you think Darby falls under? Not only do they make Darby look like a moron after failing to take out the Giant with a dive on the floor, but fast forward about a minute later, while Sanjay and Satnam are walking to the back, a masked dude in a Sting mask comes out from the opposite end of the building and hits Darby with a baseball bat, a weak-ass looking gut shot to the ribcage, by the way, and then he sends Darby back into the ring so Lethal can then hit him with the lethal injection for the 3 count. Flatter than 3 o'clock. And of course, everyone's immediately asking the obvious, who is the fake Sting fella? To which my first thought was, it's got to be Matt Farmer. I mean, AEW loves their completely dated Nitro cameos. We were probably bound for a Matt Farmer appearance at some point. No, instead it was Cole Carter. And I know what you're probably thinking right about now. Who in the Lord Almighty is Cole Carter? Well, I have no idea. But apparently we were all supposed to know, and by me, I mean 2.5% of AEW's overall audience, because these people sure as hell didn't know who he was. And after absolutely zero reaction for this moron that no one's ever heard of, they start playing Sting's music, giving us the tease that he was going to come out and run everyone off and bring at least some bit of good to this segment. But instead, who should randomly show up unannounced and unhyped but Jeff Jarrett with a guitar? And we all know what to expect when Jarrett's got a guitar in hand. I mean, he only broke 10,000 of them in his entire career and never drew a dime off of it. So, of course, he smashes Darby over the head with the guitar. Darby takes the bump like he's dead. And then Jarrett does a relatively decent heel promo talking about the legacy of the Jarrett family and something about how after he's through with AEW, people are going to be left in body bags. So apparently you're just allowed to imply that you're going to commit first-degree murder on live broadcast television. No one's going to bat an eyelash at it. But you can't say the word shit more than once in a 2-hour period. Got it. So, yeah, that was a totally nonsensical segment. Way to totally bury Darby Allin 10 feet below, too. Have him get taken out by a complete nobody that we've never seen or heard of before. Job him out in the opening match on TV after the heels were sent to the back. And then have him get laid out by a 50-something-year-old Jeff Jarrett with a guitar shot. While he's lying there on the mat selling for like 5 minutes and Jarrett's cutting a promo over him. So they pretty much ended Darby's career as we know it. As for the Jarrett thing. Look, I've talked a lot about Jeff Jarrett on this channel before. We're actually talking a lot about his WWF segments right now when he first came onto the scenes in the WWF in '93. I'm not a Jeff Jarrett hater, but I've definitely had what you would probably call a love-hate relationship with him over the years. If you grew up around the 90s and 2000s and you sort of analyze the perpetual ramming and force-feeding of Jeff Jarrett on television, whether it was WCW or TNA in the latter years, you know what I'm talking about. I understand how much the Jarrett family means to the wrestling business, and I am thankful for everything they've contributed to protecting the legacy of the business throughout the years. But it doesn't mean that I have to sit here and defend Jeff Jarrett being rammed down my throat as a main event guy for the better part of 10 years. In the WWF, he was a serviceable mid-card heel. He was never pushed as a top guy, nor was he ever viewed as a top guy. WCW and TNA were very different stories, and I think a lot of that had to do with who was in charge, who Jeff Jarrett was friends with at that point. With TNA, I get it was his baby, so maybe he felt that he was owed that top spot for giving guys opportunities outside the WWE that they hadn't seen since WCW closed shop in 2001. But again, it doesn't mean that I have to defend it. I've always viewed and seen Jeff Jarrett as a fine mid-card talent. At one point, I could even tolerate him in the upper mid-card scene when he wasn't being featured in title programs or main event programs. But, you know, especially from that period in WCW from like 99 till basically the end of operations in 01, God almighty. I mean, that guy was one of the most insufferably pushed guys to watch most weeks. It just never felt natural. I never bought Jeff in those roles. And, I mean, certainly by today's standards, Jeff Jarrett would definitely be a top guy. You know, in the late 90s and 2000s, when you still had guys that were well and above his status and everybody knew it, unacceptable. No reason that guy should have ever been in those roles. Now, I don't know what his involvement is going to be with AEW. I mean, not that long ago, we literally just saw him calling a WWE match as a special guest referee. Can't even remember what that was for. It might have been SummerSlam or something or from earlier this year. And now he's just randomly showing up here in AEW unannounced. Apparently aligned with Jay Lethal and Sanjay Dutt. Is it a TNA reference? Is it him serving as a mouthpiece for the group? I don't know. But AEW has a lot of things they need to fix right now from a booking standpoint. And I don't think the solution is giving Jeff Jarrett a live microphone every week. We'll see where it goes, but again, I'm just going to restate my main talking point when it comes to Jeff. He's been around for years. I respect what he's contributed to the business and what his family has contributed to the business. But there are just certain guys that have been overexposed and overpushed for so many years now. Jeff Jarrett is one of the first names that always pops up on that list for me. I don't personally see how he's going to contribute to AEW as a backstage hand in any way that doesn't directly benefit him. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But I just don't see how this is of net benefit for AEW's overall bottom line. It's another legend showing up for the initial nostalgia pop. He'll probably be irrelevant in 6 months, but that's just me. Then Jon Moxley wrestled Lee Moriarty for some reason. Did you know Lee Moriarty apparently has an 11-2 win-loss record in 2022? Can anyone actually remember the last time that guy wrestled on television? I couldn't recall a single Lee Moriarty match I've ever seen, period. Much less within the span of the last 11 months. Why didn't you just have Mox wrestle Ethan Page? Dude was sitting right there on commentary. He's a hell of a lot more interesting than Lee Moriarty and his hideous green dye job. It was a good model for how mediocre his ring work is. And look, not trying to demean Moriarty here. It's nothing against the guy, but this goes back to everything I've ever talked about when it comes to Tony's mark booking mentality. Lee's been a complete nothing burger in this company for the better part of 3 years now. He randomly shows up and disappears. Right now they got him shoehorned in this totally meaningless firm faction with Stokely Hathaway that means nothing. It's just 5 guys randomly paired together, and we're all supposed to just accept that they're friends and big deals. But as a viewer watching at home, why the hell would I care about watching this match? You can't just take an underneath guy that's meant absolutely nothing, put him against the world champion, have a competitive back and forth match with him, and think that's enough to get people to buy into him. All this did was drag Moxley down, because whether or not I like his ring work, I don't. He's still your fucking world champion. It's taken him the better part of 10 minutes to beat this random job guy that's done absolutely jack shit in your company since he showed up. Honestly, the most telling part of this segment was the random point where the fans started going ballistic, even though Mox and Lee were essentially doing nothing. Turns out there was a famous basketball player that started walking through the crowd and caught everyone's attention. So whoever was supposed to sneak him in for his cameo appearance, they failed epically. But, I mean, let the record show, random hometown celebrity basketball player is leaps and bounds more interesting than the AEW World Champion. You know, the alleged top guy of your company. Not that anyone actually buys that. Not to gloss over the match, but seriously, who gives a fuck? Put Mox in there with Ethan Page or even Big Cass, maybe there'd be a reason to care, but Lee Moriarty? Come on now. This is supposed to be a major wrestling company, and you're sticking job guys in there and having competitive matches with your top babyface world champion? Mark booking. That's all this is. So after that, they did a sit-down with Renee Paquette and Saraya, where I guess somehow they're going to get medical doctors to sign off on clearing Saraya for a return match with Britt Baker, presumably at the Full Gear pay-per-view in a few weeks. And with AEW's track record of injuries, I would not want to be in Saraya's shoes if that match actually goes down. Didn't she have spinal stenosis at one point? And they're actually going to clear her to wrestle? They deserve what they get. So at this point, I think we were supposed to get the ROH title match. At least that's what the graphic read before they cut the break. I mean, Excalibur was plugging it. And because I forgot this is amateur hour we're dealing with, we did not, in fact, get the ROH title match. Instead, we got a Billy Gunn birthday celebration with the Acclaimed, which was leaps and bounds better than the ROH title match, which we'll talk about shortly. And only with these guys would they be able to pull something like this off. Any other set of guys that tried what the Acclaim did here, it would have fallen flatter than a plate full of piss by the end. Luckily, the Acclaimed and Billy Gunn actually have the charisma to be able to pull something like this off. Of course, they're doing their whole scissoring shtick. They got their pink foam scissoring fingers on hand, which were perfect plugs for Shop AEW. So, of course, they're immediately going to increase merchandise sales right then and there. There was a deal in here where they took a shot at WWE's DX reunion segment and told Billy that they didn't show up tonight because Billy no-showed their reunion on Raw. That was cute. I also smiled when Bowens mentioned Billy Gunn being voted as part of Worst Match of the Year back in the mid-2000s with the whole Reverse Battle Royal deal. Thanks for that one, Russo. And of course, they get to the part where they're going to award Billy with, I think they called it the adoption certificate. So Papa Billy has officially ditched his own flesh and blood for the new cool kids on the block, which is highly comedic when you realize that as soon as Austin and Colton came down, they're immediately admonished with the Ass Boys chant. And watching Colton and Austin stand there doing their whiny, bitchy heel promo, you know, now that I think of it, those two really do have two punchable douchebag faces. No wonder Billy Gunn left them for Bowens and Caster. I don't blame him. At least Caster and Bowens are cool. But of course, the Ass Boys were there so that Morrissey could jump them from behind. And while the heel beatdown's going on, FTR eventually make the save. Still getting a massive pop for their entrance. Even though we literally just saw them do a job to Swerve and Keith Lee last week. They do the face-off with the Acclaimed here while they're holding up the AEW belts. To which I said, you know, if you're going to tease the fucking program, then why didn't you just put FTR over Swerve in Our Glory last week? Now they're going to once again delay another 8 months before we actually see FTR even get the AEW tag title shot. They got every other god-blessed belt in the world, but the one company they're actually contractually signed to can't seem to get their hands on those belts for whatever reason. It's almost like someone's influencing Tony Khan's decision-making and advising against FTR being the AEW tag champs. Who could have ever seen that coming? So anyway, then we got our regularly scheduled ROH title match. Now that Excalibur found his fucking format and took his butt out of his ears. Cat was already out of the bag with this one. I sort of name-dropped him in passing during the Punk rant. And isn't it oddly convenient how as soon as Punk disappears from the equation, who should make his TV return but Colt Cabana, who received an ROH World title shot against Chris Jericho on the show, despite A, not being booked on AEW television in well over a year, and B, not having done anything to actually earn a championship shot other than standing in the background of an outlaw indie faction for his entire run. Also, here's another random question. I thought Chris Jericho was only wrestling former ROH World Champions. When the hell did Colt Cabana ever win the Ring of Honor World Championship? I mean, I didn't follow his entire history from ROH, but I don't think Cabana was ever a Ring of Honor World Champion at any point. At least, not in a recognized capacity. Regardless, he's back. And after this week, probably won't be seen again for another 7 months, knowing the way Tony Khan books. I mean, it was odd. I mean, certainly not a bad wrestling match or anything. Colt was obviously emotional coming through the tunnel. I really don't know what the idea was here other than to try and stick it to Punk. And we can debate whether or not it actually worked in the end. And you can tell people were valiantly trying to start a Colt Cabana CM Punk split chant during the match. I mean, it very quickly subsided, but you know, the effort was there. It's one of those things where it's totally apparent what the goal was by doing all this. It was a political move and really nothing else. Anyone that tries to see it any other way is fooling themselves. The most hilarious part to me in all this is the people that are going to be sitting there going, oh, Tony Khan really stuck it to Punk this time. What a middle finger move this was. What? He was giving Punk the middle finger by putting Colt Cabana on TV and then jobbing him out to Chris Jericho in 7 minutes? Yeah, I'm sure Punk is gritting his teeth right now, shaking his fist at the television screen. How dare you, Tony? Yeah, way to stick it to the man. And look, I'll say this. I don't hate Colt Cabana. I don't have anything against him. watched him for years. I wouldn't say he ranks among my top 50, top 100, or even top 500 of all time faves. I'd probably put him at a reasonable, comfortable 472 on my all-timers. Just throwing out a random number. However, all joking aside, when it comes to Colt, I've always been in the camp where anytime I see him doing any of the hokey comedy, it's an immediate turnoff for me. But whenever he plays it straight and decides to act like a grown professional wrestler, I'm usually all right with him. Here, he was mostly sticking to the basics. He had what I would call a perfectly acceptable wrestling match with Chris Jericho. And aside from them beating him flat in the end, which I laughed at, I don't really see what other point this served. If it was to send Punk a message, again, how does beating the guy in an 8-minute TV match really send a message to the guy that no longer works with the company? I mean, if they wanted to actually stick it to Punk, they would have put Cabana over Jericho and made him the champion. Now that's sending a fucking message. But, all this really seemed to do was feed Jericho's ego even more by putting him over on TV. All the while, Cabana, I expect he'll go away again and we won't really see him on TV until they randomly decide to put him in backstage skits with the job order again. And no one will care. Just like no one's really cared about anything Colt's ever done in AEW, despite the fact that he's been a central focus on this whole all-out media scrum investigation. On the topic of not caring about things, I could not tell you how anyone could possibly think an Orange Cassidy, Ray Phoenix, Luchasaurus three-way for a completely wordless belt was going to entice viewers. Good God almighty. Orange Cassidy, Ray Phoenix, and Luchasaurus doing three-way spots on live broadcast TV. I mean, you could dedicate an entire Botchamania video to that match alone and still need a part 2 carryover. So I didn't watch that. And then came a segment that I was actually fixing to avoid like the plague when they first promoted it. But the idea of the sheer horrors that I was envisioning in my head prior, the thought of how horrific this would end up being by the end, I actually decided to watch this just to see if I would be proven right. And it wasn't too far off. It was wretched for a whole other reason. Not making this up. They actually booked this and advertised it for the show. Jade Cargill versus Marina Shafir for the TBS title. And the first thing I wrote down in my notes, they've got to be ribbon. There is no way on God's green earth they're serious, right? Well, they were serious. They weren't ribbon. No, they were ribbon. They were ribbing something. Because they pretty much had Jade spend the better part of 2 minutes beating down Marina like a government mule. All the while Nyla Rose and Vicky Guerrero attempted to distract Jade from the top of the ramp. And in an ideal world where this was done with people that were actually over and didn't generate go-away heat, I maybe could have bought this. This was not Stone Cold Steve Austin walking out during a Lance Storm match on TV and doing everything to try and detract attention from the match to put it on him. Because, this isn't a shocking revelation or anything. Feel free to write this down in case you're taking notes. But, Nyla Rose, she's not Stone Cold Steve Austin. I know. Revolutionary detail there. So, Jade retained, nobody cared, and this was another complete waste of a TV segment. And for the record, I usually skip over a lot of the girl stuff on this show. The division sucks since day one, and seeing Nyla Rose back on TV kind of reinforced that thought. I have no idea why she was holding the TBS title captive when I'm pretty sure Jade is supposed to be the champion. I have no idea why Vicky Guerrero is still around. And moreover, I do not care. Then we had the main event. Even though last time we saw Brian Cage on TV, I'm pretty sure he was getting jobbed out to Wardlow for another pointless mid-card belt that no one gives a crap about. Now he's wrestling Samoa Joe for another pointless mid-card title that no one gives a crap about. And for the record, how Brian Cage earns a title shot after losing a previous title shot, meanwhile Wardlow, the TNT champion who already beat Brian Cage prior, maybe was on screen this week for all of 8 seconds. Your guess is as good as mine. I'm sure it's part of a secret mastermind plan from Mr. Booker of the Year that will be explained in 7 months from now when no one could possibly care. I mean, I watched the match. I almost fell asleep while doing so. Not really to fault anything either guy was doing, honestly. I've never been the biggest Brian Cage fan in the world. I mean, he looks phenomenal from a genetic standpoint. He's just another one of those dudes that's kind of toiled around AEW for ages now. You know, they really haven't done anything constructive with him in the last couple of years to get me to care about him. I still hate that he does all that lucha flippy shit. You know, a guy that size, there's no reason he should be doing dives and flips. You know, on the other hand, not much else needs to be said about Joe. It sucks they've kind of booked him into oblivion. Should have been a much bigger deal than he ended up being in the grand scheme of things, but that's kind of Tony's gimmick in AEW. He brings guys in with all this fanfare and all this momentum, and then 3 to 6 months later, they're completely irrelevant. Yeah, the match wasn't horrendous or anything. Again, I don't really get Brian Cage. I never understood what people saw in him. He's kind of on the subject of guys like Karrion Kross, where maybe he was a big deal in Impact at one point. Of course, that's like being the nicest guy in prison. You know, maybe Brian Cage was a big deal when he was over there, but in AEW? I mean, they kind of had something when he was part of that whole Team Taz deal a couple years ago. I think Powerhouse Hobbs sort of outclassed him because Hobbs clearly has more tools than Brian Cage does. You know, then they turned Cage babyface, and he pretty much faded into the background shortly thereafter. Generally, I wasn't a fan of the spots where Cage was just picking up Joe and recklessly throwing him around the ring onto his shoulder and neck. You know, that spot where Cage almost dropped Joe on his neck, giving him that pump handle throw. That was fucking amateur hour right there. But again, it's another one of those AEW matches where it doesn't really build to a climax or anything. They just do some back and forth stuff for a while, and then Joe randomly catches Cage in the coquina clutch, and that's it. Ends out of nowhere, and the crowd doesn't really react to it because there was no build to the finish. Now, Joe winning was obviously the right call. I wish we could see Joe wrestle more on TV because, you know, he's good when we see him, when he's not in the federal witness protection program. I still hate that him and Wardlow are just a random makeshift team for no reason. Clearly just another example of Tony having no clue what to do with either guy, so he just woke up one day and said, let's do a team called War Joe. Meanwhile, they're going to have him feud with a random set of ROH guys that we've barely seen, whatever their team is called. The Gates of Agony. God, that's so gay. But, you know, I guess this was designed to try and draw attention to Ring of Honor's Final Battle pay-per-view, which I guess will be taking place in December after the Full Gear show. So, get excited about that, if you can. I mean, sorry if this just came across as a milquetoast AEW recap, but there really wasn't a whole lot for me to say about the show overall, except for me continuing to ask a lot of questions of why. Like, I mean, that's honestly what I was asking. Pretty much everything they announced on the card from the beginning of the program. Jon Moxley versus Lee Moriarty. Why? Samoa Joe versus Brian Cage for the ROH TV title. Why? Jade Cargill and Marina Shafir in a TBS title match that goes 2 minutes and does nothing but expose AEW's women's division as being the drizzling shits. Why? Why is the firm being shoved down our throats when nobody cares about them? Why are they trying everything in their power to sabotage the people that we actually want to see every week? The guys that could potentially draw money for the company. The guys that could actually be stars if Tony would listen to the right people and run with them when they're hot. FTR, Wardlow, Ricky Starks, Powerhouse Hobbs. He won't do it because they're not in the right camp, because they're not friends with the right group of people. It's almost incredible to actually think Tony would be willing to go out of his way to sabotage all of those guys to prove a point, but damn. After seeing what they did to poor Darby Allin on the show this week, I don't even know what to expect anymore. And I'm not a big Darby Allin fan anyway. But telling you, man, as the ship continues to sink and Tony continues to take advice from the wrong people, we're just going to keep watching that baby sink week after week until there's nothing left of it. What do you say to it? Enjoy the decline, folks. Enjoy that decline. Now, I know what you're thinking right about now. Oh my God, there's no NWA World Championship Wrestling review this week. What is going on? I have no idea. Apparently, they just didn't air a November 1st episode from 1986. So no NWA review this week. But with the gap week for World Championship Wrestling, we can jump right over to Dallas TV. World Class Wrestling from November 5th, 1983. A pretty interesting little card for the week. It was less Von Erich Freebird-centric for a change, which gave it a nice change of pace. The opener was Mike Reed versus Black Gordman, which stemmed from Gordman's first appearance on Dallas TV last week, where he attacked Jose Lothario shortly before his scheduled match. Sort of a first viewing experience of watching Gordman in the ring for me. The name had sounded familiar when he showed up, but I had never seen any of his matches prior. He was a little before my time, and by little, I mean like 10 years. At least when it came to his prime work in Mexico. But he was an old school, fun heel. I dug a lot of the overselling whenever Reed would have him on the mat working over a body part. I also liked the part during the match where he was shouting at the fans saying, "Shut up, Mexican." Direct quote. As if Gordman just presumed whoever he was yelling at was Mexican. Maybe they were, but it was still funny. And the last minute of the match was also funny. Unintentionally, but this was all on Mike Reed. They do a spot where Reed is hitting Gordman with shoulder blocks off the ropes. And after the third one, Gordman goes to sidestep him. And I think Reed was supposed to just run to the other side of the ropes and then come off so Gordman could hit him with a knee. Instead, Reed decided to take a phantom bump onto his face like someone had shot him in the back with a gun. Actually, no, you know what it looked like? You ever watch clips of people on YouTube ice skating or rollerblading and they just randomly eat shit by falling forward on their faces? That is what Mike Reed looked like at the end of this match. Just running in a straight line and then boom, just goes ass over tea kettle. And even Gordman looked at him like, dude, what the fuck? Then he put him away with a DDT like 2 seconds later, which Bill Mercer referred to as some sort of net breaker. Close enough, I guess. And that was followed with sort of a special attraction match, Girls Action, which in the year 1983 was considered a special attraction because, well, you didn't see it that often on television. Now, in today's gynocentric social order, you got women's segments up and down the card, and none of them are special or attractions. In fact, most of them are considered bathroom breaks for the vast majority of wrestling fans. Not to come off as misogynistic and just spitting facts, I mean, look at the weekly ratings for most women's segments on modern wrestling programming. I mean, you gonna lie to my face and say people are actually going out of their way to watch it? Anyway, this one was billed as the 147-pound Judy Martin, whose graphic read 155 pounds, taking on Princess Victoria of native blood from Canada. Very odd. Victoria, I think we may have called one of her previous matches on Dallas TV. I don't remember ever calling a Judy Martin match yet. I don't believe I've ever seen a Judy Martin match either, so this was also a first. And I will give both girls credit. They at least looked like athletes. Judy Martin looked like she'd kick the shit out of most girls in the business today. It was a pretty good match, per women's standards. Like I said, both girls at least look like grown adult athletes. It's also nice to watch a women's match where they aren't caked out in makeup like a bunch of overly processed Barbie dolls. You always kind of forget that there was a point in time where female wrestlers were just actually presented like normal competitors. Didn't need all the eyeshadow or foundation to make them look purty. It's one of those things you take for granted now because every girl comes out for a match and it looks like they're getting ready for a girls' night out at the club. It's like, it's a fucking wrestling match, dude. It'd be like if a guy was decking himself out in a 3-piece suit going for a world title match on a pay-per-view. Fucking ridiculous. So this is kind of refreshing to see. I also liked here, Princess Victoria and Judy Martin are telling this story early on where Judy kept pulling Victoria down to the mat by her ponytails. And there was a part where Victoria wrestled Judy down to the mat, and while Judy was trying to claim that her hair was pulled, David Manning asks Victoria, and real sweetly, she just goes, "No, sir." It was the most feminine delivery. I loved it. And then, after a couple minutes of hair pulling from Judy, when David finally catches her illegally yanking her down to the mat, David steps in and physically grabs Judy by the hair to pull her off Victoria. No way in hell that shit would ever happen in today's business. The company would be getting lawsuits filed at them by the network for male-on-female violence. Even something as innocent as hair pulling. Remember when girls were allowed to get spanked on national television and the people would pop for it? Good times. But, these girls had some real fire here. Judy was probably one of the best female heels I've ever seen all year. Probably a toss-up between her or Rhea Ripley, who hasn't wrestled a lot this year, period. Solid face and heel dynamics from both girls. Victoria made a good little comeback at the end. Throwing some heavy chops on Judy, too, that sounded real good on camera. Good forearms, too. Yeah, the rope running was kind of another story. That was, well, let's just say, could have used some work. I was getting some Jenna Charmel vibes in there at one point. Not that this was anywhere close to how abysmal that match was. Far from it. But the deal at the end where Victoria came off the ropes and caught Judy with a crossbody for the pin came out of nowhere, but the crowd went nuts for it. Made better by Judy trying to argue with David Manning after the fact that she had her tights pulled, when it was clear as day that Victoria hooked her far leg. Gotta love when the heels are still trying to argue the official's call, even though it's plain as day that they lost clean. But, yeah, pretty good stuff here. Solid women's match. I would honestly even recommend you go out of your way to check it out, if you have any way of obtaining the footage. That was followed with a 60-second Kevin Von Erich pre-tape, where they kind of just played a slow-mo of him walking down the aisleway through the fans with overdubbed funky jazz music. And I've got to admit, the first thought that came to mind here, watching Kevin in a slow-mo with a robe on, no t-shirt, getting grabbed by women so they could kiss him on the cheek, the soothing jazz music in the background. This was about one step away from coming off as a glorified porno. I was incredibly uncomfortable there for a minute. Whoever chose this music to dub over the original, D-. Unless the idea was to get everybody wet to see Kevin Von Erich. Then in that case, job well done. The girls probably went wild for that. And that was followed with a pretty cool little semi-main. Kamala versus the Junkyard Dog. A rare Dallas sighting from JYD in 1983. And thankfully, this was still about a year before he totally gave up and phoned it in from a physical standpoint. He still had some body definition here. Still a little pudgy around the midsection, but not to the extent he would be in 84 in Mid-South, right before he left for the WWF. And I always like JYD, but, someone that spent years going back and reliving some of those old Mid-South tapes from the early to mid-80s, watching the decline of JYD in that time period was, really kind of sad when you think about it. Here in 83, he was still a little motivated. God, man, you want to talk about actually being over? Go back and watch your JYD tapes if you want to learn how that guy could get the most out of almost nothing and still be over to the degree he was. You watch the match in a vacuum with modern eyes. It's the most boring, nothing happening match you've ever seen. Watch it with the volume off, you'd probably put yourself into a coma. But, God, listening to the crowd react to this thing, it's almost otherworldly how into this thing people were. You got Dog standing there with Kamala in a chin lock, and people are standing on their feet screaming at Kamala to give up. And the few seconds later, Kamala's grabbing JYD's pec and putting him on some kind of nerve hold. These Dallas fans are going batshit trying to rally behind Dog here. Again, man, getting the most out of virtually nothing. JYD was one of those baby faces. It never mattered what that guy did in the ring from a work standpoint, even if his matches were usually boring as all get out and didn't involve a lot of moves per se. That guy was still one of the most over baby faces in the Southern Territories. And even with the match ending in a fucked finish because of Skandar Akbar getting involved, didn't matter. Because as soon as JYD was able to run off all the heels, these people were all on their feet throwing babies in the air over it. Especially when Kamala accidentally hit Akbar with a chop after JYD ducked it. That probably got the biggest reaction of the entire segment. Just Kamala giving his manager an inadvertent chop to the head. All I can do is encourage any young fan out there, if you really want to know what it was like to truly be over with an audience back in the day, you need to go watch your Junkyard Dog tapes, preferably before his WWF run when he was motivated and in shape. So, basically talking anytime from 1980 to 1983, that 3-year gap. Even when he wasn't in the best in-ring shape, Mid-South 84, that was still prime JYD. A real hot period for him, up through the summer before he left. Nobody could ever replace Dog, no matter how hard Bill Watts tried. And he did try, believe me. But JYD was one of a kind. A truly remarkable talent. I could talk for hours on end about him, but, the experts have already kind of covered the ground on him. Just, again, don't go back and watch any of the artificial tapes where you hear canned noise or anything like that. Go out of your way to try and find original tapes. They're out there. Listen to the crowd react to JYD, man. It's just, it's impossible to describe. It's a whole different world of wrestling fans. And you just can't compare it to today's fans. Two entirely different landscapes. And then the main event for the show, Johnny Mantell and Chris Adams versus Terry Gordy and Michael Hayes. Or at least that was the scheduled match before those no-good Freebirds changed the stakes. Because Hayes tried to jumpstart on Adams before the bell, and while Adams was chasing Hayes around the ring, Gordy attacked Mantell and put him in the Oriental Spike. And of course, as we all know, the Spike has put numerous men on the shelf, up to and including Kevin and David Von Erich and Bruiser Brody. So, evidently, Mantell was taken out of the match, unable to compete, which gave Chris Adams two choices: to either forfeit the match or work in a handicap situation. And of course, I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure out which option Adams was going to settle on. Even if he couldn't defy the odds, he was not going to go down without a fight. You also had people piping in the JYD chants here. Boy, could you have actually imagined how big a pop that would have gotten? Unfortunately, they didn't get JYD. They got a pretty good runner-up, as we came to find out a little later on. But for the first part, Adams tried to fight at the 2-on-1 advantage, or disadvantage, I should say. And of course, he ended up getting overwhelmed. But Adams fought hard here. Ended up actually out-wrestling the heels early on. Even at the 2-on-1 disadvantage, the Freebird still needed to cheat behind the ref's back multiple times throughout the match to get the advantage. I do not think I'll ever get the image out of my head of watching Hayes squirm over to his corner and leap onto Gordy like a koala bear, cowering in fear. That was quite the visual. Even Terry Gordy looked quite uncomfortable there. But they eventually get to the spot where the heels are working over Adams. And who should come out to substitute for Mantell but Kevin Von Erich? In street clothes, obviously. And when Adams got the hot tag to Kevin, he came in like a wild man. Started unloading on Hayes and Gordy. Ended up rolling Hayes up into a sunset flip for the pin. And when the heels realized that their plan backfired, they spent a minute or so in the ring throwing a hissy fit over it. The heels were outsmarted and humiliated. Foiled. They had a plan. It failed. And the people began mocking them by the end. Justice be had. But, yeah, that was the main event. And we will see what happens next week if the Freebirds can get a little bit of redemption on the Von Erichs for sticking their nose in Gordy and Hayes' business. Some tells me, based on the track record of Freebird versus Von Erich matches, I don't think they're going to get their revenge. But guess we'll wait and see. In the meantime, though, it was a solid little program this week. Very weird program, but it really changed up the card a little bit. You know, anytime I get to talk about the dog, it's a good time. If we were reviewing Mid-South tapes, we'd have more frequent discussions about him. As it was, though, even in Dallas, the guy was over like God. Again, man, you really cannot capture that reaction that JYD had, even by today's standards. Like, you've heard pops for guys, you've seen the ovations for returns like CM Punk, even to a lesser extent, the one Bray Wyatt got at the Extreme Rules show. But JYD's fan reception was truly timeless. Again, it's hard to describe how over that guy was, but listen to experts and historians talk about it if you don't believe me. It's just, if you didn't experience it live, you can't really tell the story because modern fans won't understand it. It just won't sink in the right way. Again, it's two entirely different spectrums of wrestling fans going back then, but JYD had a real appreciation from the fans. Those people, they live vicariously through JYD. It's a shame when you really look at sort of the decline of his career and just everything that kind of came of JYD after that 84 period when he just let himself go and to a lesser extent stopped caring, getting involved in drugs, having a bad rapport with Bill Watts and the whole Mid-South region. It's a shame. It's kind of a wrestling tragedy if you really think about it. But going back and watching these tapes, man, you just remember JYD for the good times. And that's all you can really do at the end of the day. So anyway, hopefully you enjoyed that program. Yep, there's a lot to take away from everything that's been going down with AEW this week. Chime in, share your thoughts, let me know about any thoughts you have. I'd be willing to have a discussion about it. Good, bad, or indifferent. I'm always open for interpretation, and even if you disagree with my points, you can feel free to chime in and share your feedback on it. Until the Monday show, where we continue with our Retro Raw report and the SmackDown report, we might touch on the Saudi Arabia show a little bit. I still honestly have not made up my mind whether or not I'm actually going to watch that show. More than likely not. I might share some brief thoughts on it. I might catch some highlights if I get the chance, but am I actually going to sit down and watch that 3-hour show or however long it goes? Probably not. You know, it's also taking place in mid-afternoon on a Saturday, and I got other shit I'm doing, so can't really devote any time to it. But we'll see. If there's anything worth talking about, we might briefly talk about it on the Monday show, but don't expect a long-winded report. Anyway, take care all. Peace out.